Picture this. You're 7 years old, playing with wooden dolls in your family's castle, when suddenly the great oak doors burst open. Men in elaborate robes stride into your chambers, their faces serious as stone. Your mother falls to her knees, tears streaming down her cheeks as they announce that you've been chosen for a great honor. You're to be married to a king, a man you've never met, in a land you've never seen, whose language you don't speak. The wedding will take place within the month. You don't understand why your mother is crying. Isn't this supposed to be wonderful? Aren't fairy tales filled with little girls who dream of marrying kings? But as the days pass, and you're fitted for elaborate gowns that weigh more than you do, as foreign tutors arrive to teach you customs you can't comprehend, you begin to realize this isn't the fairy tale you imagined. This is something else entirely, something that will steal your childhood and reshape your life in ways no 7-year-old should ever have to endure. Throughout history, countless young girls found themselves thrust into marriages that served everyone's interests except their own. These weren't love stories or even typical arranged marriages between social equals. These were calculated political transactions where children, some as young as 6 or 7, became pawns in games of power they couldn't possibly understand. Before diving into these forgotten stories of innocence lost and resilience found, if you enjoy learning about the darker truths hidden in history's shadows, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. Please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it remarkable that we're exploring these difficult stories together from different corners of the world, united by our shared need to understand the human cost of political ambition. The practice of child marriage among European royalty wasn't an aberration. It was standard operating procedure. Kings and nobles viewed their daughters not as individuals with hopes and dreams, but as living treaties, human contracts that could seal alliances and secure borders. The younger the bride, the longer the political alliance would theoretically last. A 6-year-old princess could potentially produce heirs for decades, ensuring her husband's dynasty while cementing diplomatic ties between kingdoms. But behind the grand ceremonies and political celebrations lay stories of profound human suffering. These little girls, torn from everything familiar and thrust into adult roles they couldn't comprehend, paid the ultimate price for their father's ambitions and their new husband's political needs. Let's begin with one of the most heartbreaking examples from medieval France. In the year 1160, a child named Margaret was born into the world already betrothed. She was the daughter of Louis VII of France, and before she could even walk, her marriage had been arranged to Henry the young King of England, son of Henry II. Margaret was 2 years old when the betrothal was formalized, too young to understand that her entire future had just been decided by men who saw her as nothing more than a valuable asset. The wedding took place when Margaret was barely 5 years old. Can you imagine the terror? Picture a little girl who should have been learning to read and playing with toys, instead being dressed in heavy ceremonial robes and walked down the aisle of a massive cathedral. The ceremony was conducted in Latin, a language she didn't understand, binding her to vows she couldn't comprehend, to a boy she barely knew. Contemporary chronicles describe the wedding as magnificent. Bishops blessed the union, nobles celebrated the political alliance, and poets composed verses about the joining of 2 great kingdoms. But nowhere in these glowing accounts do we find any consideration of what this meant for Margaret herself. She was a political symbol, not a person. Young Margaret was immediately separated from her mother and sent to live at the English court, where she would be raised according to English customs and traditions. The trauma of this separation cannot be overstated. At an age when children desperately need stability and maternal comfort, she was thrust into a foreign environment where every face was unfamiliar, every custom strange. The English court appointed tutors to teach her proper English etiquette, but they also assigned handlers whose job was to ensure she developed loyalty to her new country rather than her birth nation. She was systematically cut off from French influences, forbidden from speaking French except during formal diplomatic occasions, and surrounded by English nobles who viewed her with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. Margaret's husband, Henry the young king, was only slightly older than she was, but even as children, their relationship was defined by the political necessities that had brought them together. They weren't playmates or companions. They were future co-rulers whose primary responsibility was to produce heirs to continue both royal lines. The pressure on these children to fulfill adult roles was immense and psychologically devastating. As Margaret entered adolescence, the true horror of her situation became clear. She was expected to begin producing children as soon as she reached physical maturity, regardless of whether she was emotionally or psychologically ready for motherhood. The medieval understanding of female development was primitive at best. Court physicians determined readiness based solely on physical signs, with no consideration of mental or emotional preparedness. The relationship between Margaret and Henry grew increasingly strained as they matured. Henry, influenced by his father's political ambitions, began treating Margaret more as a breeding vessel than as a wife. Their intimate life became a matter of state concern, with court officials monitoring Margaret's menstrual cycles and pressuring the young couple to consummate their marriage more frequently. Margaret's letters from this period, discovered centuries later in monastery archives, reveal a young woman struggling with severe depression and anxiety. She wrote to her confessor about feeling trapped, about nightmares that haunted her sleep, about a profound sense of isolation that no amount of luxury could alleviate. These weren't the complaints of a spoiled princess. They were the desperate pleas of someone whose childhood had been stolen and whose adult life offered no escape from duty and obligation. The political pressures surrounding Margaret's marriage intensified when she failed to produce children quickly enough to satisfy both courts. French and English nobles began questioning whether the alliance was worth maintaining if it didn't yield the expected heirs. Margaret found herself caught between competing loyalties, blamed by the English for not being sufficiently fertile and criticized by the French for not advancing French interests at the English court. The psychological toll on Margaret was severe. Court observers noted her increasing withdrawal from public life, her reluctance to attend ceremonial functions, and her growing reliance on religious devotion as an escape from her circumstances. She spent hours in prayer, perhaps finding in spiritual contemplation the only realm where she could exercise some control over her own thoughts and feelings. Margaret's story illustrates a pattern that repeated throughout medieval Europe. Young girls sacrificed on the altar of political expedience, their individual needs subordinated to the perceived greater good of dynastic alliance. These marriages weren't just uncomfortable arrangements, they were systematic destruction of childhood innocence in service of adult political ambitions. The tragedy deepens when we consider that Margaret's suffering wasn't unique or even unusual. Across medieval Europe, similar stories played out in castle after castle, as little girls were married off to seal treaties, end wars, or strengthen territorial claims. Each wedding celebration marked not just a political victory, but a personal catastrophe for the child at its center. What makes these marriages particularly disturbing is how they were celebrated and romanticized by contemporary society. Poets wrote beautiful verses about young love, artists painted idealized portraits of royal couples, and chroniclers described these unions as blessed by God himself. The reality, frightened children forced into adult roles they couldn't understand, was carefully hidden behind layers of ceremony and propaganda. The impact on these young brides extended far beyond their wedding days. They grew up without ever experiencing normal childhood development, without forming healthy relationships with peers, without learning to make independent decisions about their own lives. Many developed severe psychological problems that plagued them throughout their adult years: depression, anxiety, and what we would now recognize as complex trauma responses. Tomorrow, we'll delve deeper into more of these tragic stories, examining how the practice evolved and spread across different kingdoms. The wedding night traditions surrounding these child marriages reveal perhaps the darkest aspects of this medieval practice. When Agnes of France was married to Alexios II Komnenos of the Byzantine Empire in 1180, she was just 8 years old. The Byzantine court, with its elaborate ceremonies and ancient rituals, created a spectacle around what should have been recognized as an unthinkable crime against childhood. Agnes arrived in Constantinople after a grueling journey from Paris, seasick from the Mediterranean crossing and homesick for everything she had left behind. The Byzantine palace, with its golden mosaics and incense-filled corridors, must have seemed like another world entirely. She spoke no Greek, understood none of the court customs, and found herself surrounded by eunuchs and courtiers whose very existence was foreign to her French upbringing. The preparation for her wedding night involved rituals that would be traumatic for any child. Palace servants bathed her in perfumed oils, dressed her in silk robes that symbolized her transition from child to woman, and instructed her in duties she was too young to comprehend. The Byzantine tradition required the young bride to be examined by court physicians to confirm her virginity, a humiliating process that reduced a frightened little girl to a commodity whose value needed verification. Agnes's husband, Alexios, was barely older than she was, but he had been raised in the Byzantine court's atmosphere of political intrigue and ceremonial importance. At 12 years old, he understood that his marriage to Agnes was crucial for securing Western support against the advancing Muslim armies. The weight of empire rested on this union between two children who should have been playing games instead of consummating a marriage that would determine the fate of nations. The palace records from that period, preserved in the archives of Hagia Sophia, include disturbing details about the consummation ceremony. Court officials waited outside the bridal chamber to confirm that the marriage had been properly completed, treating the sexual initiation of an 8-year-old girl as a matter of state importance. When Agnes emerged the next morning, pale and shaken, the court celebrated the successful alliance while ignoring the obvious trauma of the child who had made it possible. Agnes's subsequent years in Constantinople were marked by constant surveillance and pressure to produce heirs. The Byzantine court appointed Greek tutors to transform her from a French child into a Byzantine empress, but this cultural conversion came at enormous psychological cost. She was forbidden from speaking French except during official correspondence with her father, cut off from French customs and traditions, and surrounded by people who viewed her primarily as a vessel for continuing the Komnenos dynasty. The loneliness Agnes experienced was profound and crushing. Contemporary Byzantine chroniclers noted her frequent illnesses, her reluctance to attend court functions, and her increasing reliance on prayer and religious devotion. Modern historians reading these accounts recognize clear symptoms of severe depression and anxiety in a child whose world had been completely upended for political purposes. Agnes's situation became even more precarious when her young husband Alexios II was murdered in a palace coup in 1183. At just 11 years old, she found herself widowed in a foreign land, her political values suddenly uncertain. The new emperor, Andronikos I Komnenos, solved this problem in typical Byzantine fashion. He married Agnes himself, despite being old enough to be her grandfather. This second marriage reveals the complete objectification of child brides in medieval politics. Agnes had no choice in the matter, no voice in determining her own fate. She went from being the wife of a boy emperor to being the wife of an elderly usurper, all while still being a child herself. The age gap between Agnes and Andronikos was so extreme that contemporary chroniclers, despite their acceptance of child marriage, expressed discomfort with the arrangement. The psychological impact on Agnes of this second forced marriage was catastrophic. Palace observers noted dramatic changes in her behavior. She became withdrawn and listless, showed little interest in food or entertainment, and spent most of her time in the palace chapel. What they were witnessing was a child's complete psychological breakdown under circumstances that would challenge the resilience of a mature adult. Agnes's story took another tragic turn when Andronikos himself was overthrown and killed in 1185. At 13 years old, she had already been widowed twice, had lived through multiple palace coups, and had seen firsthand the brutal realities of Byzantine politics. The trauma of these experiences marked her for life, creating psychological scars that would never fully heal. The new Byzantine emperor, Isaac II Angelus, faced the same problem his predecessors had encountered: what to do with a young widow whose political significance was both valuable and dangerous. Rather than allowing Agnes to return to France or enter a convent, he arranged yet another marriage for her, this time to Theodore Branas, a Byzantine nobleman loyal to the new regime. By this point, Agnes had learned to navigate the treacherous waters of Byzantine politics through complete emotional detachment. Court records describe her as moving through her third wedding ceremony like a sleepwalker, performing the required rituals without any visible emotion or engagement. She had developed what modern psychology would recognize as dissociative responses to trauma, a way of psychologically surviving experiences too overwhelming to process normally. Agnes's third marriage finally provided some measure of stability, but the damage from her childhood experiences was irreversible. She never formed normal emotional attachments, struggled with what appeared to be chronic depression, and showed little interest in the political intrigues that consumed everyone around her. The vibrant, curious child who had left Paris at age 8 had been systematically destroyed by the machinery of medieval diplomacy. The most heartbreaking aspect of Agnes's story is how completely her individual humanity was erased in service of political necessity. She became known to history not as a person who had suffered unimaginable trauma, but as a successful diplomatic tool who had helped secure important alliances. Her pain was invisible to the chroniclers who recorded her marriages, her psychological collapse dismissed as feminine weakness rather than recognized as the natural response to systematic abuse. Agnes's experience was replicated countless times across medieval Europe, as young girls were fed into the machinery of dynastic politics. Each wedding celebration marked not just a political triumph, but a personal catastrophe, as children were stripped of their innocence and thrust into adult roles they were psychologically unprepared to handle. The normalization of these practices reveals something disturbing about medieval society's view of childhood and female agency. These weren't seen as crimes against children, but as necessary sacrifices for the greater good of political stability. The systematic nature of these child marriages becomes even more chilling when we examine the careful planning that went into them. Medieval courts maintained detailed records of eligible princesses across Europe, tracking their ages, health, and potential political value like livestock inventories. Marriage brokers, often high-ranking clergy or experienced diplomats, traveled between kingdoms carrying miniature portraits of young girls, negotiating their futures with the same attention to detail that merchants used when trading spices or precious metals. Consider the case of Constance of Castile, who in 1154 became a bargaining chip in one of the most calculated political arrangements of the medieval period. At just 6 years old, Constance was promised to Louis VII of France as part of a complex agreement involving territorial disputes, trade routes, and military alliances. The negotiations took months, with representatives from both kingdoms haggling over dowry amounts, inheritance rights, and even the specific age at which the marriage would be consummated. What makes Constance's story particularly tragic is how meticulously her childhood was planned and controlled from the moment the betrothal was announced. French tutors arrived at the Castilian court to begin her transformation from a Spanish princess into a future Queen of France. They taught her French customs, French language, and French ways of thinking, systematically erasing her original cultural identity before she was old enough to understand what was being taken from her. The tutors' reports, preserved in monastery archives, reveal the disturbing efficiency of this cultural indoctrination. They documented Constance's progress in adopting French mannerisms, her growing fluency in the French language, and her gradual acceptance of French religious practices. But between the lines of these clinical assessments, we can glimpse a more troubling reality: a young child slowly losing connection to her birth family and native culture, molded into someone else's vision of what she should become. Constance's letters to her mother, written in increasingly awkward Spanish as her French education progressed, show a child struggling to maintain emotional connections across growing cultural and linguistic barriers. She wrote about feeling confused by conflicting instructions from her Spanish nurses and French tutors, about missing familiar foods and songs, about having dreams in languages she was being taught to forget. The wedding ceremony itself, conducted when Constance was 9 years old, exemplified the medieval approach to child marriage: elaborate public celebration masking private trauma. The cathedral in Paris was decorated with tapestries depicting the union of two great kingdoms, while poets composed verses celebrating the young bride's beauty and virtue. But contemporary accounts also mention Constance's obvious fear during the ceremony, her trembling hands as she exchanged rings with a man more than twice her age, and her tears during what should have been the happiest moment of any girl's life. The French court's treatment of Constance after her wedding reveals the complete lack of consideration for her emotional well-being. She was immediately subjected to intense scrutiny regarding her potential fertility, with court physicians conducting regular examinations to monitor her physical development. These medical assessments, described in clinical detail in palace records, treated a 9-year-old girl's body as state property, whose reproductive potential needed constant evaluation. Constance's relationship with her significantly older husband, Louis VII, was complicated by the impossible expectations placed on both of them. Louis, despite being a grown man, was under tremendous pressure to treat his child bride with appropriate patience, while also fulfilling his royal obligation to produce heirs. The solution, according to court advisors, was a carefully scheduled progression of intimacy designed to prepare Constance for full marital duties, while maintaining the political fiction that their relationship was normal and appropriate. Palace records from this period include disturbing references to educational sessions designed to prepare young Constance for her future role as wife and mother. These lessons, conducted by older court ladies who had themselves been child brides, focused on teaching submission, compliance, and acceptance of whatever her husband required of her. The psychological impact of this systematic conditioning cannot be overstated. A child was being systematically programmed to accept her own exploitation. The most heartbreaking aspect of Constance's story is how her own letters reveal her internalization of these lessons. As she grew older, her correspondence shows increasing self-blame for her inability to immediately produce children, anxiety about disappointing her husband and both royal courts, and a growing sense that her worth as a person was entirely dependent on her reproductive success. When Constance finally did become pregnant at age 14, the celebration throughout France was immediate and intense. Church bells rang across the kingdom, nobles hosted feasts to celebrate the news, and diplomatic messages carried word of the pregnancy to courts across Europe. But for Constance herself, pregnancy brought new terrors. She was barely more than a child, physically and emotionally unprepared for the challenges of carrying and delivering a baby. The pregnancy ended in tragedy when Constance miscarried in her 6th month, an event that sent shockwaves through the French political establishment. The loss was treated not as a personal tragedy for a teenage girl who had lost her first child, but as a political crisis that threatened the stability of the Franco-Castilian alliance. Constance found herself blamed for the miscarriage by court physicians who suggested her Spanish temperament or foreign constitution might be incompatible with French royal blood. The psychological aftermath of the miscarriage devastated Constance in ways that the medieval court was ill-equipped to understand or address. She developed what modern medicine would recognize as severe postpartum depression, complicated by guilt, anxiety, and the overwhelming pressure to immediately conceive again. Court observers noted her increasing withdrawal from public life, her loss of appetite, and her tendency to spend hours staring silently out of palace windows. Constance's subsequent pregnancies followed a pattern of hope, followed by devastating loss. Each conception brought renewed optimism from the court and crushing pressure on Constance herself. Each miscarriage or infant death was treated as a political failure rather than a personal tragedy, adding layers of guilt and shame to her already overwhelming burden of grief. The cumulative effect of these repeated losses, combined with the isolation of her position and the constant pressure to perform her royal duties, gradually broke down Constance's mental health entirely. By her early 20s, she exhibited clear symptoms of what we would now recognize as complex post-traumatic stress disorder, emotional numbness, dissociation from her own experiences, and an inability to form normal human relationships. Palace chroniclers of the period described Constance's later behavior as increasingly erratic and unpredictable. She would sometimes disappear from court functions without explanation, spend days locked in her chambers, refusing to see anyone, or break into tears during seemingly normal conversations. What they were witnessing was the psychological collapse of someone whose entire life had been structured around impossible demands and expectations. The tragedy of Constance's story extends beyond her individual suffering to encompass the broader system that created such outcomes. Her experience was not unique or exceptional. It was the predictable result of treating children as political commodities rather than human beings deserving of protection and care. The medieval aristocracy had created a machine for destroying childhood innocence, and it operated with terrifying efficiency across generations. The documentation surrounding these child marriages reveals another disturbing pattern: the complete absence of any consideration for the girl's own wishes, preferences, or emotional needs. Marriage contracts from this period read like business agreements, specifying dowries, territorial exchanges, and inheritance rights, while never once mentioning the welfare of the children whose lives were being permanently altered. Tomorrow, we'll explore how these practices evolved and spread to other regions of Europe, and examine the long-term consequences for the women who survived these childhood ordeals. The stories of Margaret, Agnes, and Constance represent just a fraction of the countless young girls whose childhoods were sacrificed on the altar of political ambition. These weren't isolated tragedies. They were the inevitable outcomes of a system that valued treaties over children, alliances over innocence, and dynastic power over human dignity. What makes these stories particularly haunting is how thoroughly they were erased from official histories. The chronicles that documented elaborate wedding ceremonies and celebrated diplomatic victories rarely mentioned the psychological destruction of the children at their center. The tears, the trauma, the systematic breaking of young spirits, all of this was considered irrelevant to the grand narrative of medieval statecraft. These little girls, torn from their families and thrust into roles they couldn't comprehend, paid the ultimate price for their father's ambitions and their husband's political needs. Their suffering reminds us that behind every great alliance, every peace treaty, every dynastic marriage celebrated in history books, there often stood a terrified child whose voice was never heard and whose pain was never acknowledged. Perhaps most importantly, these stories force us to confront uncomfortable truths about how societies have always been willing to sacrifice the vulnerable for the perceived greater good. The machinery of political power requires human fuel, and throughout history, children have been considered acceptable casualties in the pursuit of adult objectives. Today, we remember them not as successful political symbols, but as individuals whose humanity was stolen in service of causes they never chose to serve.